Well, welcome everyone. Welcome everybody. Good morning. I see people from the East Coast and England, so welcome. Get your coffee, get your water, get your tea, and let's get started for today's session. So thank you for coming today and attending the part 3 of our 2021 leadership series kickoff, Bigger Imaging, our third of 5-part series focusing today on conceptions. As you know, we are the Society for Sustainable Events, and our mission is to advocate and educate around sustainability in the meeting and event industry. And our great educational program like today will continue. For today's event or series, many thought leaders and organizers have come together in the time of environmental crisis to unite our industry with a plan and offer a change. We can't wait to make a difference. So before we start, I will ask everybody if you don't mind muting and on a housekeeping note, and then we'll go and thank our sponsors for today. But before that, I would love to start by introducing, I don't know if he needs an introduction, but our host for today, Paul Salinger. Paul is a former vice president of marketing for Oracle and past president for the Green Industry Council. At Oracle, he led the company's event sustainability initiatives from 2007 to 2020, creating industry-leading approach to event sustainability for all of the company's global events. Now retired from the corporate life, but not retired from ongoing work on rethinking and reimagining the approach to sustainability, Paul is working on a number of projects that continue to educate, ask the hard question, and propose new solutions within the industry. Paul, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Thank you, Christophe. I'm great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And let me add my welcome to all of you watching this session today. If you have questions as we go through our discussion, please put them in the chat and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the panel discussion. When we started designing this leadership series, we knew that we needed to focus on some of the biggest sustainability issues facing the industry as we begin to reimagine a future-forward approach for events. We landed on 3 key topics that are a challenge for the events industry: carbon, consumption, and supply chain diversity. In early August, we delivered our session on supply chain diversity with a great panel that led into the first of the discussion cohort groups on the topic, and their work is ongoing. We will deliver a session on carbon in the near future, so look for a date soon on that key topic as well. But today we're focused on consumption. It's a big topic, and the sheer scope of how much waste gets generated and how we think about what we create, how we use it, and how we dispose of it would likely take us many sessions to cover. One of the biggest areas of consumption and waste in the industry comes from the exhibit or trade show floor, from the multitude of conferences and expos globally. So for the sake of focus, we're going to address that as our consumption topic for this year in the leadership series. As with the other topics in the series, this session will be followed by a series of cohort discussion groups that are your opportunity to interact with each other and subject matter experts to dive deeper into this topic and start to work on new ideas and new solutions to solve the consumption and waste issues in the industry, and specifically on the exhibit floor. The first group discussion is scheduled for October 13th, and we'll talk more about that later. So let's get started, and let me introduce the person who is most responsible for putting together the panel and content for today's session. Now, she's in an area that's a bit sketchy for internet today, so she's not going to really participate, but I want to make sure that we recognize Melinda Kendall. Melinda is the Vice President of Sales at Sustainable Brands. She oversees the business development team, helping them match SB's clients' goals to the right opportunities to support them in their sustainability journey. Prior to joining Sustainable Brands, she was the Senior Vice President of Sustainability at Freeman, where she was a member and sponsor of Sustainable Brands, a supplier supporting the event, and an attendee and speaker. In previous roles, she headed up sales teams, sales enablement, and marketing at a variety of event and media companies. So I'm going to jump right into introducing the panel, and we'll get into our discussion, and then we'll go from there. So we have a truly dynamic group with us today for this discussion, with a wealth of experience in the sustainability field and in dealing with sustainability issues on the exhibit floor. Let me quickly introduce them. So Lindsay Errol, I've known Lindsay for many years, going back to our days working together on the Green Meeting Industry Council. Lindsay has worked tirelessly in this industry, helping to write the original APEX standards for sustainable events. She has a ton of background in helping venues create sustainability programs and is now Director of Sustainability for APTIM Environmental Services. Lindsay leads business development related to Aptim's suite of sustainability services for all lines of Aptim business with commercial and public clients. Welcome today, Lindsay. Our next panelist is Glenda Brunkhart. Glenda is a member of the Corporate Experiences team for HP Inc. As Trade Show Event Marketing Program Manager, she's responsible for strategic trade shows and events. Glenda joined HP in August of 1977, so she's been doing this for a long time. Been in trade shows and events for the past 30 plus years. During those 30 plus years, she has helped create and implement the HP's Global Performance Measurement Program, and most recently, she helped create a sustainability playbook for HP events and trade shows. Welcome, Glenda. Marissa Heller is the Sustainability Operations Manager for Freeman. Over the years, I've worked closely with Freeman in my role at Oracle and have seen them develop a robust approach to sustainability, from looking at materials used in signage and booth design, to creating small green booths for rentals, to working with exhibitors to reduce their waste footprints and create strategies for reuse of materials used on the show floor. Welcome, Marissa. And then last but not least, we have Sherida Sessa. Sherida is the brand director for the Green Build International Conference and Expo. In this role, she oversees all strategy and planning for the Green Build event annually, including strict adherence to a robust sustainability program. In 2019, the last time they had their in-person event, Green Build achieved True Zero Waste Platinum certification for the third year in a row and became one of the first events to earn the Events Industry Council Sustainable Events Standard Platinum level certification. So welcome, Sherida, welcome all panelists. So let's get into our discussion. I want us to start very sort of high level. And Sherida, I'd like to actually start with you. What would you say, from your perspective, is the top challenge in terms of exhibitor waste, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me, everyone. When I read this question, I struggled with it, to be perfectly honest, because picking one challenge is a tough thing, right? There's a multitude of challenges that we face, but many of them can be overcome with proper planning. I would have to say that I think the biggest challenge from our perspective is not adhering to the guidelines. It's not creating the guidelines in the first place. It's not measuring our sustainability. It's really getting the buy-in from exhibitors to not just check a box on a survey and go through the motions, but to actually become engaged with the guidelines and become invested in our guidelines, and really make sure that they're sort of seeing that through from conception of their booth all the way through the actual event. Just overcoming that check the box mentality, I think, is the biggest obstacle for us. And if you can get over that hurdle, the limits are completely removed from what you can do.
Yeah, and I know it's been a bit of a journey for Green Build to get to that true zero waste. And so can you just elaborate a little bit more in terms of the partnerships that you've created with your exhibitors to really get to that true zero waste and overcome some of the challenges that you just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's this is obviously not a one-man show. The partnerships to create a zero waste event start from 10 years in the past when you select a venue for your event. It goes all the way through from selecting a venue that we advocate for LEED certified buildings to begin with. When you select your vendors, this has to be a conversation up front so that everyone knows what they're getting into and what standards they'll be held to. On the exhibitor side, it's an educational journey. It's having that conversation with them up front when they're first interested in green build, in not just selling the value of actually exhibiting in the event, but selling the story and selling the dream and selling the fact that, we can't put it on an event about sustainability if we're not being as sustainable as humanly possible, and really getting them to invest in that journey mentally from day one. So we don't ever talk to a prospect. Our sales team never speaks to a potential customer without talking about sustainability requirements of the event and why it's important. And we all know that storytelling and communication goes a really long way. So being able to clearly articulate, how much waste goes into a landfill at a typical trade show and how we can overcome that, and the value that it provides to the community and to the venue and to the city that you're in. All of these sort of emotional pleas really make a big difference in getting the exhibitor to buy into this from day one. Then we have, when they get to the point of contract signing with us, we have a full list of sustainability requirements that they have to sign off at that point on. That contractually obligates them to follow the rules. Yeah. Even though, that's not necessarily always the case. It certainly takes a little more coaching from that point on. Additionally, we have a customer success department that then works with our exhibitors. Of course, Freeman is a huge partner to us in actually setting up the booths and setting up the trade show floor and making sure that we're coaching our exhibitors all the way along, that we're answering those questions, and that we're really guiding them. At the end of the day, we don't want this to be a threatening situation where we stand over top of them and tell them they have to adhere to these guidelines or we're going to rip them off the floor, because at the end of the day, that's not going to produce any long-term change. We want them to really buy in on the value, and then make sure that once they know these things, they're not just using them at Greenbuild, but then these guidelines, whether required or not, will transfer to their other booths at other events, and the ripple effect occurs.
Yeah, great. So Marissa, let's have you jump into this conversation, because as a supplier to Greenbuild, what have you seen, and what have you seen in terms of the challenges for exhibit waste as it relates to partnership, and as it relates to just how do you manage all of this stuff from a general services contractor perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I think a big part of this is just the idea of garbage in, garbage out. So if we're bringing in unsustainable materials, if we're bringing in custom booth builds that can't be reused, that we really need to rethink not only the materials that are coming in, but really looking at the before and the after. So we really need to look at procurement. What products do we have? What are we offering? And how are we explaining those offerings to our clients and exhibitors so that they can make the most sustainable choice, and that they understand where their carpet is coming from, where it's going on the back end, what those what percentage that they can are going to lose within that, and looking at just kind of the big picture of what's coming into the show. And then on the back end, we have work to do as well. So is that going into the garbage, into recycling? Is it getting shipped back to the warehouse? And those are all things that we can work with our clients on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Greenbuild aside, I mean, what are you seeing as big challenges with other kinds of conferences and expos in terms of waste when it comes to the exhibit show floor?
Yeah, so we're always going to see some waste coming off the exhibit show floor, but looking at kind of the big picture of what's going in is making a big difference on what ends up in the trash at the end, or what's left behind on the show floor. So really trying to look at that holistic picture is making a big difference for us. And that's things like moving to our new Flex system versus our old MIS system. It's looking at ways that we can encourage our clients to bring in less waste to begin with. So removing aisle carpet, things like that. And just getting everybody on board with sustainability. And if sustainability is not a priority or a top priority for them, encouraging them through pricing and through our models to make a more sustainable choice.
Okay, great. Lindsay, you've worked with a number of different venues, and from a venue perspective, what do you see as kind of the big challenges in terms of what comes into a venue? How can the venue be a partner with some of these conferences in terms of sustainability? What are you seeing as the bigger challenges from a venue perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, venues we're the host, right? We are the host of these events, and we really do have to rely on collaboration with the events that are coming into our facility, the contractors like Freeman or GES, and then even some of our in-house contractors, food and beverage wise. And so, um, unlike, a event organizer, we don't have a lot of, um, interaction with the exhibitors, but we definitely have to kind of deal with what they're bringing in. And so, it's been really interesting, being from the venue perspective. You get to see, back to kind of your first question, like what's the biggest impact for exhibitor waste? And it really depends on the type of event. And it's really fascinating to see the difference in waste from like a green build to a fashion event to a food show, and the different challenges that each one of those present. I think on some of the underlying, issues that you see across all events are a lot with, like Marissa had said, the single use custom builds. Although we are starting to see a trend towards more rental packages, which is great. I know, some of the larger trade show companies like Informa and Emerald are actually making goals to increase the use of reusable booths instead of custom booths, which is great. We're also starting to see a lot of events eliminate carpet, which has been a really interesting shift as well, because that's been a really big issue that venues have to deal with on the back end, and there's not a real great solution. So that's been really a nice trend to see. But yeah, I think the biggest challenge is that we just need to work with every aspect of the event without necessarily having a lot of control over what comes in, because at the end of the day, we're here to host the event. We're here to host the event for the city and really kind of support in whatever ways needed. But I will say what we do, specifically at the Colorado Convention Center, where I'm based, we try to make sure that our practices are set up so that we can support in the best possible way. So all of our standard operating procedures default to more sustainable practices. So we're making sure that our staff understand that materials go into the recycling and the compost and the landfill. We have our reclaim room, and we've actually just recently worked with several different venues as well to support this. But we're starting to eliminate the ability for clients to bring in foam core signage, because that's one thing that is, there's alternatives out there that are just as usable, and it really is something that we just think needs to be eliminated from the procurement for events.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that in terms of, is there a role that venues can play in terms of helping to, I don't know whether mandate is the right word, or just guide people in terms of the kinds of materials that could come in that could help solve some of the waste problems?
Yeah, it's like what Sherida said, it's more of a education than it is necessarily a mandate. And that's where our biggest challenge, because that starts, for a convention center, that starts at sometimes the convention and visitor bureau level, then to the sales level, to then the event manager level. And so you have to have that touch point almost at every single time, but letting them know why and engaging them rather than, putting it as a mandate or a penalty, but really, being a resource as well, which is what we try to do. We try to connect, any of our event organizers, if they're coming in and they don't maybe have past experience with sustainable events, having someone at the venue like myself, we're able to be a resource and be a guide and a touch point for them and try to help them in this practice. And then hopefully they take that to their next venue and kind of able to expand upon their practices year to year.
Yeah. So let me bring Glenda into this conversation. So from a client perspective, for somebody who not only puts on your own conferences, but goes to other conferences and trade shows, what are the challenges that you're seeing in terms of how to manage waste from your perspective?
I think it starts, you brought up supply chain earlier. So when I look at our choice of who we partner with, who we choose as our vendors, is to make sure they're on the same path that we are at HP. So it starts with, what are our choices around exhibitry? Which parts do we want to be a custom build? Which ones do we want to reuse? Choice of printing. When I look at our opportunities of what we can print on, and I'm hearing out there about the foam core, and I agree, there's a lot of other medias out there that you can print on that will help get rid of that. But also that the entire ecosystem, when I go to a floor or a show, is to make sure that they also are not putting in processes or guidelines that are gonna derail my effort. So let's say I come in and I bring my entire booth in on one truck. I should be able to leave the show floor with my booth on one truck. I should not have to worry about getting hit with extra charges of special handling or something to restack my outbound material to fit back on that one truck. So I've got to look across the entire system. My budgets aren't increasing. Right. And so I need to be able to maximize that and know what I'm going to get hit with. So, all of that goes into managing, our efforts there. Okay,
great. So in terms of, if we've mentioned a few materials in this discussion so far, carpet and foam core signage and some other things. Glenda, from your perspective, what are the kinds of materials that you're starting to look at and change that can help reduce the waste factor? And what materials are still a problem in terms of going into the waste stream?
So I'll go back to kind of exhibitry. We're looking at the different types of materials. So is there falcon board? Is there reusable fabrics, that we can over time, by not customizing it too much to a specific event, that can be used by multiple groups within our company. We're looking, when we're building cabinetry, is there a bamboo or something else that's a more of a renewable resource than other materials we've chosen in the past. We even have gone to the point of, when we build our crates, that we've built the skids to be no sides on them, and you don't have to band them or shrink them. There's actually a stretchy, cord that holds the lid on. So, we've tried to look at all those other materials that use once and you throw it away. Why not come up with the design? Yeah, you spend a little more time on the upfront, but on the end, not only do I save on things that I'm not throwing away, but it also saves in other parts of our program.
Yeah. No, that's a great way of looking at it, in terms of looking at it from a strategic standpoint, in terms of reusing materials for other events, and or just being able to recycle them or upcycle them into a different use altogether. Sherda, what from a perspective that Greenbuild has gotten to true waste, is there a strategy that you sort of took in terms of materiality and materials that helped get you there? And what materials are you still sort of struggling with?
Yeah, there's been a lot of work on the materials side from Greenbuild throughout the years that predates me, truthfully. And there are still some that we struggle with, but it's a I think Glenda's point that the upfront planning is the most critical piece of this. And you don't necessarily have to be green build overnight. It's a process, and you take steps on the continuum. You know, for our purposes, I think several of the things that have already been mentioned are worth noting again. You know, staying away from any PVC or vinyl products, those foam core signs. Of course, there are alternatives to those now as well. But a lot of it, again, goes back to that planning. It's making sure that we put thought into what we're producing in the first place, not necessarily, you know, where it's going to go in the waste stream ultimately, but number one, do we need it? Is it serving a really thoughtful purpose? Or can we do without it? Or is there an alternative that we can use instead of producing that item? So we, of course, I mean, a hot button issue for us are those novelty giveaways that you see at trade shows where everybody's got their squishy football and whatever else is given out in the booths and the tons of paper. So we try to coach and train our exhibitors to stay away from all of that stuff. At the end of the day, people hold on to it for, you know, 24 hours and then chuck it in a garbage can, whether it be at the event or, you know, back in their hotel room or when they get home. We also try to stay away from, you know, certain types of carpet. We sway toward carpet that can be reused or that has recyclable properties. Vinyl flooring, we stay away from all of the time. Also, signage is a huge issue. People love to put, you know, dates and one-time information on signs so that they can only be used at that individual event and then end up having to be either thrown away or recycled. So we try to be really thoughtful in any signs that we produce. Number one, do we even need it? Is this a sign to make us feel better? Or is this a sign that people actually need with useful information on it? And then again, how can we genericize any information that we're putting on the sign so that I can use it next year and the year after and, you know, store it rather than having to throw it away? And then one I think that people often forget is food waste. So all of those, you know, plastic utensils that people use and throw right in the garbage, all of the individually packaged items, especially now with COVID, that stuff is tough. That's a material challenge that we always have. So we try to stay away from disposable serviceware whenever possible. We use China over anything disposable. And then we've made a very significant effort over the last few years to make sure that any serviceware that we use is compostable if it's not China.
Yeah, great. And do you work with your designers? Do you work with your other stakeholders in terms of like getting them to rethink, you know, for example, putting dates and places on signage? I mean, how much of it is an interaction with suppliers and internal stakeholders in terms of changing the thinking around materials?
Yeah, it really is. It's an education process, both inside your organization and then with all of your suppliers. And we're lucky with Green Build that Informa takes it very seriously. So the education starts at the top throughout our entire organization. But then also for our partnership with Freeman, who does all of our signage and decorating production on site, that partnership goes back many, many years. So sometimes they even correct us on things, you know, and vice versa. But it definitely is an education process where any continuity that you can have in vendors or in staff makes a huge difference because they, you know, they know the thinking and know the strategy without you having to educate. But, you know, it's great to spread the good word as well.
Yeah. Lindsay, from your perspective, not so much from a venue perspective, but just in your past, you know, kind of engagement with the whole industry around writing the APEX standards, for example, what do you see changing? I know you mentioned foam core signage. What other changes are you seeing in terms of materials and the way people are thinking about materials to where they can start thinking more circular and keeping products in use and keeping materials in use versus sending them to landfill?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen less of, you know, not to just stick on the signage piece, but, you know, definitely going from less of the dated signage. I've been starting some really interesting, I just was at Natural Products Expo East, and they had a really interesting solution to clings where they hired local chalk artists and they you know, used them to actually do their directionals on the floor and any of their signage there. And so I thought that was just a really great tie-in with you helping support the local economy as well. And I think that's maybe one shift that I've seen overall, maybe not totally, I guess not necessarily totally tied to circularity, but I would say just kind of a deeper dive into, who are we procuring these materials from? Are we utilizing local sources? Are we, looking to see if our vendors are small business owners or minority-owned businesses? And so that's, I think, a really encouraging shift, is that, the industry is looking a little bit past just the surface in terms of what their procurement process is. I'm also, we're lucky, we've seen a lot of movement with technology. So of course we have, a lot more user-friendly mobile apps. And I've seen all the shows that I've gone to this year, which I guess is just like a total of 3, but have all had digital badges instead of the traditional lanyard. And that's been, and it takes getting used to. And I remember, I don't know, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when we were trying to get away from the huge program, booklet, and how, when we were trying to make the initial shift to mobile apps. And now, that's something that every event has a mobile app. And if it doesn't, you're looking for it. And so that's a change that I know some of our exhibitors are probably getting used to. I definitely got an earful from one at Natural Products, where I'm not even, the show organizer, and heard about it. But there is, it's all a learning curve, but I think technology's there. We're seeing obviously digital signage. And, there's a lot of benefits. And different contact I was working with, we were doing an audit of, if the cost to rent, a digital board versus producing, and it was actually cheaper to rent the digital board. And then they actually didn't have, they had some changes to the menu, and they were able to obviously make that change, real time, no big deal. Whereas in the past, if you had a change to like a room number or a speaker on your signage, it was, a lot of money to either produce a new sign, or all of a sudden your sign has like masking tape,
Right.
correction on it. So, there's a lot of benefits to what we're seeing with technology, I think, too, which has been really great.
Yeah. When it comes to materials that are still going, needing to be recycled or going into landfill, and I'll probably ask Marissa to comment on this as well. How can we help, or how can the event community help create markets for some of those goods to where they could be upcycled and or reused in a different way, or even repaired and keep that product in use in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a big part of this is when we look at a show like Green Build, they're sort of at the gold standard, and they may have less garbage coming off, and that might be the goal for eventually for all events to meet this type of standard. But right now, there's still a lot of material going into the landfill at most events. So shrink wrap, tape balls, Visclean, carpet cuttings, PVC. Those are just, top 5 off the top of my head. Of fabric, sorry, that probably should be number 2 in there. And when that happens in the immediate, what can we do with these materials? So, and these are things outside of a traditional recycling or composting stream. I think if we look just a little bit past traditional recycling, like we put it in the recycling bin and then it gets taken away by our waste hauler. But what's actually happening? Is this actually getting recycled? What percentages of our plastics and whatnot are getting recycled? I think we've been using recycling really as kind of a Band-Aid in our own lives and in the industry as a whole for a while now. And so we really need to think about, like you said, circularity of these products, and that might just be downcycling, looking at, can we use shrink wrap and PVC in composite decking, and can we have a company come in and pick that stuff up? And these kind of reverse logistics. I think Melinda Kendall, who put this panel together, this was sort of her original idea is that can we bring companies in to pick up these materials on the back end instead of putting them in the landfill or instead of putting them in a traditional recycling stream, so we can kind of follow these products and see their directly where they're going. And some of that circularity works into, you know, can these go to composite decking? Can we take our flex fabric and have it shredded to be used in, you know, airplane seats for cushioning, or you know, whatever that happens to be. I don't have all of the answers to that, but that's something that we're really looking into at Freeman, is some of these circular might not be the right word. Some of these downstream recycling opportunities that don't go into a traditional waste hauler system. Because like I said, we can do everything on the procurement side and encourage our exhibitors and our clients to make sustainable choices. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be some elements of waste at the end of a show.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with the most proficient materials that are coming out on the back end?
Yeah. So is it a design problem? Is it a supply problem? Where does the problem really lie, and how do we start to think about it in terms of things like carpet cuttings and shrink wrap and visqueen, and, you know, who's actually you know, using those products in a way to where we can start to think about how do we change that pattern?
I think that really depends on the material that you're looking at and what it's being used for. So when we look at our new flex system, we have lighter materials that are going into our trucks. So when we look at the overall carbon footprint, it actually ends up being a more sustainable material. But on the other side of that, we now have more fabric coming out on the back end. So can we do things like reuse those fabrics for exhibitors, like Sherida mentioned, not printing dates and maybe location on that signage so it can be reused? That's a piece of it. But the other piece is that there's still going to be fabric coming out on the other end, and what's the best way to deal with that in the most sustainable way?
Yeah.
So we got to look at it from both ends.
Right. So Glenda, you know, Marissa mentioned a couple of different things in terms of, you know, using some of these materials in very different kinds of ways, airplane seats, composite decking, whatever it may be. Are you starting to think at all in terms of materials about creating different kinds of partnerships within your supply chain, where you're looking at non-traditional partners as a means of reducing the amount of waste?
Well, not only looking at different partners, but we've, over the last couple of years, when we've done signage and made choices, if we're going to do a sponsorship or things like that, we've often had the discussion up front before we even pull the trigger on that. Is there an after use? So big example we've done is at our own partner conference, or when we've done sponsorships at big print shows, because obviously we want to show our capabilities on our printers, but what is the after use of those materials? We've taken signage and backdrops and things like that and turned it into the next giveaway. So whether we made them into reusable totes, we made them into little pencil pouches, things like that, we've built in our program ahead of time an after use plan already. So we knew what was happening with that. We weren't going to leave it and have it thrown away. We had a plan on how we wanted to use it, because again, it was another way to keep our brand in front of our customers.
Yeah.
And to also tell that sustainability story. Right.
Lindsay, let me bring you back into this discussion just for a second, because I want to get your take on this idea of creating different kinds of partnerships, or just being able to create kind of markets for some of the materials that would traditionally go into landfill.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's complex, right? Because even, you know, we've been talking with Marissa about just the idea of capturing visqueen and shrink wrap and being able to collect that and then send it to, you know, back to a manufacturer. I think she's calling it reverse distribution, which I love. But just even after you make that commitment, it's complex. You have to train up the staff that's collecting it, so the housekeeping staff, to make sure that they know that we're collecting that material separately and that's not supposed to go into the landfill anymore, which is, training, and it's achievable, but it's just another layer. And then we have in a lot of venues and events, we have United, or another layer of our contract workers, and especially how we're all experiencing such challenges with staffing, just keeping enough people on staff to be, or at the event to actually be servicing the event, to add another layer has just become a challenge that I think is new, that we maybe weren't dealing with before COVID. And again, not that it's insurmountable, but I think it's just important to point out that even once you make that commitment to try to collect these products or these materials and do something with them, post event, there's more to it than that. And it takes time, and it takes training, and it takes a lot of collaboration and coordination. The other thing I would say is, I think the industry kind of has made a shift to getting partnerships for donation programs, which is fantastic and great. I think the challenge with that is I've seen some maybe like event organizers or clients rely on that a little bit too much, where it's kind of rather than having, trying to reduce what's going into the building in the first place, or really kind of being a little bit more mindful about what is being brought to the event. They kind of have that free ticket, that with the idea that it's just going to be donated. And again, at the Colorado Convention Center, we've had what we call our reclaim room in place for 10 years. And sometimes, obviously it's a great resource, but sometimes, and I'll use the example of foam core, when we would try to get people to not use foam core, the response was, well, you're just going to donate it to the schools, and the schools are inundated. Like, they don't need the broken foam core. And we had some partners that did some really great creative things with foam core, but there's just so much. So we need to kind of think about it again from that, what are we producing and what is really needed, and reduce first, and have that be the default. And then, having creative solutions on the back end as well, but also being realistic with everything that kind of goes into just even some of those reclaim programs.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the big questions that I've had for a while now when it comes to the whole idea of consumption is, and we've talked a little bit about education in this panel, but how do we start to get our stakeholders, and it's everything from designers to attendees, to start to think differently about consumption overall? So for example, designers, how do we get designers to, think in terms of like, maybe bigger and more is not always the way to go. And thinking about materials from an upfront perspective. How do we get attendees to have less expectations around getting a bunch of free stuff? I think Sherida mentioned, the free stuff that people still bring into, their booths and whatnot. How do we start to educate people just that consumption is something that they should really be thinking about in terms of less is more sometimes?
I'll just jump in. I mean, I think that's a societal shift, right? Like, behavior change. People, been asking for years, like, what's your biggest challenge with sustainability in events? And it's just behavior change overall. It's, attendees going to a hotel room and not leaving the lights on or the TV on when they leave. You wouldn't do that at your house, but some reason when you're, at a hotel and you're not paying for the energy, you don't have the effort to walk across the room to turn off your light again, or, half drink bottles of water, and, just all of the things. It's such a mind shift and behavior shift where, that it's not just you know, the event producers or the exhibitors. It's like you said, you know, everyone that's attending. And so, you know, I've worked with event organizers where we've tried to, you know, engage attendees on the front end to make commitments to sustainability. I know, you know, Green Build does that really creatively as well. We're just incentivizing, or at least creating awareness around that their actions and behaviors actually contribute to the impact of the event. You know, it's every person that's there plays a role and a part in that. So yeah, it's that
Yeah.
attending.
So Sherda, let's bring you into this conversation because you kind of brought it up a little bit. Is it just an education thing, or are there things that an event organizer can do and suppliers can do to start to change some of the behavior patterns that lead to overconsumption?
I mean, I think a lot of it is an education effort. I think in general, you know, we're in a much better spot now than we were 5 years ago on this, because everyone is talking about it where they weren't before. You know, every brand, Glenda's a great example, is talking about sustainability and making sustainable initiatives. And so the more that happens corporately, the more consumers see that across the board in their everyday lives. And it makes a huge difference in how they think about this, you know, at a trade show, outside of a trade show, in their kitchen, in their living room, at their office, et cetera. So I think that general awareness and the fact that it's a constant topic of conversation makes a really big difference. You know, I mentioned storytelling before. I do think as a communication method that really personalizes it a little bit more than just shooting facts and commands at people. So we try to bring in real life stories of how these changes make an impact. And we do that through our legacy project at Green Build, where we actually get into the community and try to make a difference. And as Lindsay just mentioned, we do what we call sustainability pledges for all of our attendees. So we ask them to take an active role and try to explain to them that, you know, we can't be a sustainable event without their sustainable contributions and behaviors. So we talk to them up front before they ever come on site about, you know, bringing their reusable water bottles, so we're not having to give away single-use plastics at our event. And then we give them a menu of options that they can choose and commit to in advance. So we ask them to, you know, bring that reusable water bottle, bring a reusable coffee cup if they want to, and, you know, other things that they can commit to personally that really aren't a huge lift, but makes a big difference at scale across, you know, 10,000, 5,000 people, whatever it may be. And it invests them in the process. It gives them a personal connection to it. So I think then once you do that, they become a lot more mindful of their overall behaviors at the event. I don't know if it's the magic bullet or the silver bullet to this at all, but every little bit helps, certainly.
Yeah. And Glenda, how are you approaching this in terms of educating your attendees, but also educating your internal stakeholders?
Well, I mean, sustainability is one of our corporate goals. So it's easy for us at HP to make sure that's one of the goals we have for the events and that. But it is about education, but it's also about repeating it. So we've always said, if you do one thing for one event, that one thing leads to two things lead to four leads to 10. And we're trying to make it easy. And even with our sustainability book we put together, the playbook to share was, you know, we have similar, you know, the menu list, and people can choose, you know, that one thing, those two things that they can do for each of their events. And, you know, so it's a matter of getting them into that process of repeating it. Because once you get into that habit, you know, you're not going to change that habit. You're just going to build upon it.
Yeah. So, and as we all work together to kind of reduce waste, either by not creating it or by recycling it, what do you see as the various roles of everybody? And I'll start with you, Glenda. What's your role as an event organizer, or as an exhibitor, actually, you know, in terms of helping the industry to start to reduce waste by not creating it or recycling it? what's the role of the exhibitor in all of that?
Well, I think you have to have it as part of your program. So we need to look at it not as a one-off, but I need to look at the program holistically. And I need to look at all the events and activities that we would be doing across the company. It can't be, I'm going to use the term build and burn. It can't be done once and then you move on. It's, you've got to make that commitment to sit back and say, okay, what are we doing, so that it impacts this year and impacts next year, it's 10 years down the road, for us to be able to do that. I have the benefit of working for a company that I can bring our technologies into it, so whether it's the type of printing we do, the type of how our products are designed, things like that is, so leaning into and following, some of the goals that are set up as through the corporation and making sure that I ladder up to those.
Right.
In all the planning we do.
Yeah. And Marissa, from the terms of a general services contractor, what do you see as the role of the general services contractor and its interaction with clients, with exhibitors? I mean, you play such a big role in terms of, being a key part of the supply chain. What's the role of the general services contractor in terms of helping the industry to rethink and reduce the amount of waste and consumption that's going on?
Yeah, we definitely, as the general service contractor, have a huge role in all of this. Just to step back for a minute, I think one part of our role, as well as just the industry as a whole, is to really look at, and we're starting as an industry to kind of measure and look at what the real impacts are. I think we're at a point where there's sort of the perception of the impacts, whether that be carbon or waste or whatnot, what you actually see when you're walking on the exhibitor floor, and then what the actual impacts are. And understanding that it is an industry is really important and a key element to all of this. So it's not that the tchotchke giveaways are not something that, Green Build or whatnot should focus on. But when we look at the overall picture as Freeman, when I make a pie chart of what our carbon emissions are, our biggest 79% or something of our carbon emissions are transportation. So from that end, we need to really focus on that. And we look at the industry as a whole, travel emissions for attendee is a huge, probably the biggest impact. So when we look at impact from that perspective, and then we figure out how are we making these events meaningful, where going to an event, your travel is to that event is maybe equal to going to 3 or 4 meetings and flying around, to meet with different companies and whatnot. So how are we really making these events impactful so that the carbon emissions or the waste or whatnot coming out of it is looked at from that perspective? Where are the biggest impacts and how can we affect those directly and head on? So I think as an industry, looking at that all together is really important. And then there's so many, there's so many pieces to this puzzle. Figuring out what we can do right now as we build back our business and we build back the industry. What are the biggest impacts that we can have looking at sustainability just right now?
Yeah. And shared as both sort of an event organizer for Green Build, but also kind of an exhibit house through Informa. What are the different roles and interactions that you see in terms of, helping the industry to kind of create less waste?
Yeah, I mean, I think the event organizer plays an instrumental role in this entire effort. And, I've only experienced it from the event organizer perspective, but there's only one group really at a trade show that has that overall visibility to every component of the event and can affect every component of the event. And that is the event organizer. So it's sort of incumbent, I think, on the organizer to make sure that they're prioritizing sustainability. Freeman can can impact the build of the show and the actual decorating of the event, and the booth builders can impact their specific clients' booth space and the materials chosen for that. But there's so many other components of an event that only the event organizer has the power to influence. I mean, it starts right at the very beginning, from picking a venue, picking a city that prioritizes sustainability, picking a building that prioritizes sustainability, and making sure that that's a conversation up front so that those goals are really committed to by everybody from day one. And then, working with those vendors, leaning into the vendors that are going to make the commitment and that are going to work with you. And being willing to walk away from the ones that may not. That's a tough thing, but only the event organizer can do that. And the list goes on and on and on. And on the attendee side, as we just mentioned, being able to track that travel and then to purchase carbon emissions for the attendees to offset their travel. All of those things are initiatives that really no one but the event organizer can drive. And there's a million other things that each stakeholder does within their organization, but I think it's really important that it rolls up into an event organizer that prioritizes this overall. Otherwise, you're leaving impact on the table.
Yeah. And Lindsay, from a convention center perspective, how do you see convention centers, not just Colorado, but other convention centers that you've worked with as well, in terms of, how can they help, event organizers, how can they help exhibitors, how can they help, just their clients in general, to kind of rethink the whole consumption pattern and waste pattern that we're trying to solve for?
Yeah, I think, venues have such a big role in supporting, the goals. And we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place so that when, we have a client that's asking for, a reusable, China serviceware or compostable, or is making the effort to say, have, aluminum water bottles, that we're partnering with them and we're not resistant there. And that we have, again, we're offering recycling bins next to every landfill bin, that they're clearly labeled, that our staff is trained up to actually pull those bags and put them in the correct spot. And that we're really doing our part, as a venue and as our, as a standard operating procedure. If we are putting recycling bins out there and we're telling a client that we can support them in that, then we need to really be able to have the processes in place to be able to do that. And, again, working with venues, but also, from the event side, working with event organizers around the country, it's, it can be disappointing sometimes. I've worked with clients who have put a lot of effort, from Sherda's point on the front end, on looking at what they're procuring. And then when you go back of house and you see that the venue is not supporting any of those efforts, it's really pretty disheartening to the exhibit organizer or to the event organizer. And it's kind of, it's hard to not have them put their hands up in the air and say, well, whatever. And so choosing your partners, I think, having that conversation the very beginning and holding them accountable to what they say they're going to do is really important. And we all have challenges right now. Like, that is, obviously undisputable, but there are creative solutions out there. And I just value so much more, working with vendors that want to partner on a solution and aren't just like, trying to wrap the banana in plastic and blame it on, like things out of their control, because we're all creative and smart and, innovative, and we can work together on this. And so, yeah, holding people accountable. But that's what I see the biggest role for a venue is we're here to support and to have the right dumpsters in place and, everything that we need to be able to, and just say, so that's, we're supporting.
Are there particular questions or, is there a role for procurement and RFPs in this, in terms of, holding venues and holding suppliers in general to account for, doing what they say that they're going to do in the contract phase, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it come through in contracts at the Colorado Convention Center. I've seen, working with my event organizer clients, it be in contracts when they're going. I think what the challenge is having, once it's in the contract, and once that you make sure that you're following up with those vendors to make sure that they understand that you are still serious about it, I guess, if you will, and to continue to include it in every aspect of the planning process, and ask to go back of house, ask to see where is your recycling compactor, and ask for those reports and put that in your RFP as well, so that you understand that you're going to, and be engaged in the report. I mean, I've created so many reports that for event organizers that are just like out in the ether that I've never even like gotten a response back. And try to learn about your event and learn about where your opportunities are, because I think we all recognize waste is wasted money also. I mean, that is, if we're talking about budgets and we're talking about how do we kind of clamp down, I mean, you literally, event organizers also, they're paying for trash to go out of that building. So if you can have, if you can reduce the amount of waste that's being sent to a landfill, then you're actually reducing, your cost for that material handling, for, that being brought out of the building. So, participate in the sustainability of your event, I guess.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I know when I was at Oracle, we wrote a sustainability report every year for Oracle Open World, and we shared that with as many people as we possibly could, because we wanted the industry to learn from not only what we thought we were doing right, but what we thought we were doing wrong. And I'm curious, Sherida and Glenda, whether you guys do sustainability reports for your events and whether you share them out to the world so that everybody can kind of learn from what you're doing.
Yeah, we do. We do an annual sustainability report. We link it on our website. We blast it out to everyone and their mother. And it's a great question. I don't have statistics on how many people read it, but it's amazing information. I actually, every time I have a new person join our internal team, the first thing I have them do is read our sustainability report. And then beyond that, there's the front-facing sustainability report, but there's several reports that back it up. To Lindsay's point, there's an entire waste plan that's 26 pages of exactly what happens to every piece of waste and every type of waste at the event. And if you spend the time to educate yourself on those things and actually see it back of house, it's very informative. That's the sort of education process that makes a difference for people, I think, versus just reading blanket facts.
Yeah, and where do you share that information? Just on the Greenbuild website, or are you able to get it out into the community in some way for other people to access?
Yeah, we do share it on the Greenbuild website. Our partners at the U.S. Green Building Council outbound share it with their databases. We email it to our entire database as well. We do a press release on it. It's a very extensive report. We do our best to make sure that we get as many eyeballs on it as possible.
Yeah. And Glenda, what about you?
Yeah, same thing. We are getting better at putting those reports together. And not only do we share them with the team that worked on it, but also share with our partners and our vendors that work with us on the event. The other thing we do, and we do lean into when we're choosing a venue, a hotel or whatever, we ask them what reports they have for us, what information they can share with us, what programs they already have in place, so that we can lean into those and utilize those as well. And we ask them, how would we get that information on reporting? Food donations, what they do with the food waste. Are they, is it a recycling effort that, leftover food waste goes to a pig farm, or, are they working with local agencies to donate it to? So yeah, we're looking for all that information to be able to put it into a report that people can quickly understand.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna ask one final question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So this has been a very broad-ranging conversation, and like I said, we could kind of go on forever around the whole idea of consumption. But if you were to think about what's the one most impactful solution that we could start to work on together? And this could lead into what we do in the discussion groups. What might that be? And I'll start with Marissa.
Well, you're putting me on the spot here. I think when it comes to waste, as sort of these big picture ideas, what if, like Lindsay said, having a recycling bin next to the trash can? What if we just took recycling away? What if we said there's no recycling at this event? How would we design our event differently? And let's start there and design for that. I'm not saying take recycling bins away, because there is still elements of recycling that are working, cardboard recycling, glass recycling. There are still things that are working, but what if we just shift our perspective at this event? We can't recycle. And
is it taking the recycling bin away, or is it taking the landfill bin away? So people really just don't have an option of putting stuff into landfill.
No, let's think about not having recycling as that Band-Aid, because
Got it.
that's how we're going to design away from recycling and away from landfill. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we think, hey, we have this other option, we'll just throw hard plastics in this bin.
Yeah.
You know, some locations have a system like Colorado Convention Center to recycle shrink wrap. So let's just throw it in the recycling. But if we think about that not being an option anymore, then we're going to really think about designing from the beginning. Because if you stop recycling in your house, for people who care about sustainability, that's going to feel bad. And when you look at it on a big level, it's, that's going to feel really bad. And so that's what's going to get our mind set into looking at bigger picture. And like Lindsay said, when you look at the back end, at the loading dock at the end of a show, you might have spent money buying compostable silverware and compostable, picnicware and cups and whatnot. And I can't tell you how many times I go to the loading dock. I'm like, do you have a commercial composting program here? I didn't know the city had one here. And they're like, no. So that's just ending up in the trash. So why are we spending the extra money? How do we rethink this?
Yeah. Okay, great. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on kind of what's the most impactful solution that we could be thinking about right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of building on what Marissa said, it's taking this systems approach. So, it's not just one solution or one, change. It's really is, okay, looking at the overall system and making a strategy for that, and knowing that you don't need to do it all, this year per se, but really, when we work with clients, our first step is always the baseline. Like, what is your impact? And let's understand what you're doing. What are your practices? Celebrate what you're doing really well, and then identify and be very honest, with the areas that you have to improve, and then make goals around that. And, to Glenda's point, then, you make one change one year, the next year it's 5, and then it just builds on itself. And I think you really do, though, I think I've seen a lot of events in the past that would maybe have their programs are like throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're just seeing what sticks, but they're not necessarily looking at it for what's their most impactful change, or kind of making sure that everyone's partnering together. And that kind of leads my favorite of all the SDGs. I know we haven't really talked about that, but it was, number 17, partnership for the goals, because as this even panel, that you've pulled together represents, is every single person that's on here and every single aspect of an event is really part of that puzzle, and is really needed. The Colorado Convention Center couldn't have a great sustainability program if our event organizers are just bringing in styrofoam. It's just like, we can't do it without the work of the event organizers, and being mindful, and vice versa. So
all right, great. Glenda, what do you think in terms of, what are you looking at in terms of the most impactful solution at this point?
So I would say it's education, and educating, especially as event managers, because I think some folks are just so busy and they're just, I got so many things that I got to get done to get the show going. But if we could figure out how we educate each other, but also have a narrative, the narrative we're having today, and you've got folks from all aspects of the ecosystem, and we're having a conversation.
Yeah.
And it's not confrontational. It's
Right.
how do we solve this together?
Right.
And that's kind of, for me, I think if we continue to have these conversations and figure out how we can better educate each other, to me, you solve that, we're going to make great strides then.
Great. Sharon, I'll give you the last word here since I started with you at the very beginning, and give us your perspective in terms of like, what do you think is like one of the most impactful solutions that we can start thinking about right now?
So it is so hard for me to answer this question because Green Build, I think, is much further down the path than most events are. So I think for me, if I kind of take a step back from that, I think the biggest thing that we can all do is get the majority of events doing something, right? Like anything, it's the scale effect of, instead of having the 2 or 3 green builds and natural product expos and the people that are pretty advanced in this, it's affecting the whole rest of the continuum, the folks down on the other side that haven't done anything on it yet, or the folks that are one step into this journey and have just started. I think if we can affect events at scale and get everybody participating, then that has the ability to make the biggest impact. So I think my piece of advice on that, or my solution, would be to just start somewhere. Like, you don't have to be Green Build today. You don't have to, have this completely figured out. The important thing is, if you haven't measured or benchmarked your impacts, I think that's the very first step that people need to know. You can't improve unless you know where you started. And then, take 1 or 2 steps, take a couple of solutions, just any small step that the majority of events can take will then snowball over time. Once you've done one thing, it's much easier to do thing 2 and 3 and 4. And, that picks up speed and momentum as you go. So I think my solution, although I do love Marissa, is about just breaking the mindset and getting rid of that recycle bin. I think just getting everybody participating would make a huge, massive difference.
Great. Fantastic discussion. Again, we could probably go on for hours, but let's take a couple of questions while we still have a few minutes. And I'm going to start with a question from Emma. How do you assess whether the transport, energy, and re-engineering, remanufacturing costs to repurpose a material is sustainable? Is there a model that anyone uses for that? Anybody want to jump in on that question?
I'll jump in. There's not an exact model that we use, but when we look at waste versus carbon, it's not apples to apples. So we really kind of have to look at these as 2 separate elements. When we calculate our carbon footprint, or from a program like this, we would look at, how far are, how many miles are the trucks driving, and then the scope 3, which would be what our manufacturer. So for example, with carpet, if our carpet is going back to Dalton, how many miles is it to go from the venue back to there? And then what are their recycling processes? And on our scope 3 would be what they're doing with it on their end. But like I said, we have to look at, we're comparing apples and oranges with waste. So at some point, there is a point where it doesn't make sense to, we're not going to ship carpet back to Italy to be recycled, because that just doesn't make sense. But what we are looking at is, if we're looking at things within this reverse distribution program, like shrink wrap or, balls of tape, PVC, whatever it is, when it's getting picked up, is it baled? Is it compacted? How much space is it taking up on that truck? Can it go on a truck back to a warehouse or back to a recycling facility that's full with other things? So there's really a lot of elements to that. I'm not sure that anyone has an exact model for what that point is, but there are many things that go into that calculation.
Yeah.
I would say too, I mean, just raw material extraction practices, you know, there is, I mean, again, without doing a life cycle analysis on every single, you know, aspect of waste, but just looking at the extraction of raw materials, you know, that's a finite process, right? It's not a solution for the long term. So we do need to have these practices in place to try to collect it and recycle it, repurpose it, upcycle it, downcycle it. To me, that just seems like, even if it might not be the most efficient now, it's just building and shifting that mindset that that's the way, you know, taking away that one-time use. There's only so much of that, and every single time you throw something away and you produce something, that means it has to be extracted someplace else. So, you know, all the plastic that we're doing, that's coming from oil. So how do we look at, you know, that bigger piece too, that's also not a solution that's going to be in place? And we need to start working towards having the norm not be one-time use, but having these other solutions that we're trying to make more efficient.
Yeah. Okay, great. Is there a push for venues? Maybe this is a question for you, Lindsay, and I think you mentioned it before. Is there a push for venues to help suggest local small businesses for services to cut down on waste, carbon footprint, giveaways, activations, marketing materials, food and beverage, all the various different components of an event supply chain?
You know, I think, you know, I can only speak for the Colorado Convention Center. You know, we try to be a resource, but we also need to be engaged in that conversation. So, you know, so often by the time, you know, an event's coming to us, they have their, you know, they have their printing in place. They have all of that in place. So, I think, you know, not to put it back on the event organizer, but, you know, I think that's an important question to look at. I think, you know, engaging with the venue and the local community early on. I know, you know, Visit Denver does an amazing job of having a directory of local vendors on their website, and they actually even categorize them as like which are sustainable. So, you know, I don't know if I see that as much at the venue side, but I think the convention and visitors bureaus are like really great resources for things like that, as well as like volunteer programs and, you know, all of those different pieces, because they're kind of that touch point with the community, and you're also usually talking with them earlier on in the process.
Are you seeing any convention and visitor bureaus, or, you know, like SF Travel or Colorado or anybody actually putting a program in place focused on small and diverse businesses?
You know, I used to work really closely with Visit Denver, and I haven't in a while, but they, like I said, they have their directory, I know. But I think Portland, Oregon, I know they've always been like pretty prominent with supporting their local community as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any other direct experience with that.
Yeah, I don't know if Sherida, Glenda, do either of you have any thoughts on any of this?
I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, to be honest with you. We do this from the Greenbuild perspective. When we're planning the event, we try to source local vendors whenever we possibly can. We have a certain radius that we source food from. But I have to admit, I don't think that we're putting anything together as a resource for our exhibitors or attendees. So I actually jotted this down as a potential action of something that we could add. It's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we look to our venues and our partners that, you know, for that specific event to help guide us, because they know the area. And so, you know, anything they can provide to us, we'll definitely look into.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Have an interesting question from my friend Shauna McKinley. She'd be interested to hear panelists' perspective on how COVID-19, which we haven't mentioned at all today, is impacting waste and circularity. What challenges are you seeing, and are any solutions emerging to help manage added waste that might be generated as events and venues work to comply with public health orders and build trust related to health and safety, particularly regarding food service?
I'll just jump in really quick. I think I've seen both. I've seen a real, kind of tendency to over wrap everything in plastic and to overcompensate. We're seeing more gloves and masks and all of that, which obviously is just contributing to the waste. And I've seen, some food and beverage providers kind of use it, as, kind of revert back to old practices, kind of in the name of COVID. And while I think there's some real concerns there, I think, in some cases there's other solutions. But then in the same vein, I've seen, because of COVID things, there's been a reduction of materials. I've done a couple of reports, and the amount of waste per attendee for the 3 events I've worked on since COVID has actually gone down. And I don't know if that's because, like we were talking earlier, a move towards more digital signage, the heavy things, the carpets, the badges, less, marketing materials, because people just don't want to touch as much as well. And they're not, I was just at Natural Products, and it's a heavy sampling show. And honestly, we sorted all the waste back of house, and the amount of waste that we were producing, we were looking for the waste because we just couldn't, we're so used to so much more. And it had just, I think people were just a little bit more mindful. So, I think, there's like some silver linings that I've noticed from people just thinking through what do they want to handle as much.
Yeah. Sherida or Glenda, are either of you working with any venues at this point when you're thinking about your next in-person event in terms of how to manage waste that might be involved, around health and safety?
So it's on I will say, our next big one, 2022, it is a discussion point, but we're even having to wrap our head around what we're doing internally first.
Yeah.
Before we then take it out and, into our next big partner event, that type of thing. So.
Yeah, I would say same here. It's definitely on our minds. It's an issue that we're working through. I think it felt a little more daunting, I would say, in like February of March-ish of this cycle. And then, as people kind of got a little bit more comfortable, it seemed maybe like it wasn't going to be quite as bad as we had originally thought. We did actually just run Green Build a few weeks ago in San Diego, so my bio needs to be updated that you read at the beginning of the event. And of course, the whole masking situation, I think, is a huge obstacle. A lot of people, thankfully, are wearing reusable masks, but there's still, that's another thing. Like the trend, I feel like, went, everybody had their reusable masks last winter and into the spring. And then when people started getting vaccinated, the reusable masks went away, and people then pulled out the disposable ones again in the summer when Delta sort of kicked up. So that's definitely an issue that we have to navigate through from a waste stream perspective.
Yeah.
But we take a lot of steps on the food service side on Green Build to, not have those plastic wrapped bananas and all of that, long before COVID. So I think that piece of it didn't impact us quite as much.
Yeah. One final question, and this is maybe more for Sherida and Glenda, but anybody can jump in. Has anyone required sustainability ambassadors at live shows to help bring awareness and guidance to attendees?
I guess sustainability ambassador is not the exact word that we use, but we do, we bring in an army of volunteers at Green Build through our partners at the U.S. Green Building Council. And we ask them to really help us manage the waste stream. And it's interesting because the Green Build audience is pretty educated on what's recyclable, what's compostable, and what needs to go into a garbage can. But people make mistakes, even the most educated people make mistakes all the time. So we do bring in a lot of volunteers, and we station them specifically at our waste bins so that they can educate people that are coming up, with the compostable coffee cup, and letting them know that that is actually a compostable item and doesn't need to go into the garbage can. And so they, you know, we're very lucky. We use local colleges to source these folks, and they come and they help us. They do an 8-hour shift at Greenbuild, and we station them at as many trash cans as we possibly can. And then if they complete their shift, they actually get a Greenbuild conference pass in exchange for that, which they love. So maybe we'll name them sustainability ambassadors going forward.
There you go.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we use ambassadors, but we definitely rely on our partners for the event to help us with that. What do they have in place? Again, that's why we ask what programs they have in place, how they handle it. But the other thing we do is we make sure that any communications we go out, we tie it into our narrative. And we make sure that if we're communicating out to our attendees, our partners, and that, you know, we've tied any communication into what we send to them, you know, in there. Yeah. And then reinforce it, whether it's you know, on stage at a general session or something, we somehow figure out how to tie that message in there.
Yeah. Have you seen any venues do this, Lindsay, in terms of having sustainability ambassadors, just as a general rule?
Yeah, I mean, we've had like waste station attendants before. The Colorado Convention Center has a really big sustainability booth that's you know, that's a permanent installation that talks about sustainability at the event, but also just you know, best practices throughout Colorado. And we partnered with NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Lab, to create it. So kind of in that regard, you know, try to be ambassadors for the convention center. And we have real live data, monitors with real live data on what our solar panels are producing. So in that regard, but you know, we have been able to do the waste ambassadors before.
Yeah, that's what I've seen a lot as well.
Yeah.
All right, well, we've kind of run out of time. I want to actually thank everybody on the panel today. Fantastic discussion. You know, the next piece of all of this is our cohort discussion groups. I hope that people who are attending today and our panelists can join that. In that, we're going to examine the roles of the various stakeholder groups and identify and prioritize themes. We want to be able to leverage the wisdom, research, and experience of experts, not just on the panel, but all of you in the audience. And then we're hoping to produce some output, whether it be a toolkit, a white paper, or even maybe a model exhibitor guide. So the first of the discussion groups is on October 13th from 8:30 in the morning until 9:50 or so Pacific time. We'll be scheduling some other sessions throughout the rest of the year. You can sign up or take a QR code screenshot here if Donna brings up that slide, or open the link now that Donna is going to post in the chat. So I'm going to turn it back over to Christoph to close out the event. Thank you all for attending today. Thank you to the panelists again for your time and for contributing to a great discussion and helping us all to start to solve the waste and consumption problem in the event industry. Christoph, back to you.
Hi, actually, I'm going to jump in for Christoph. Hi, guys. Thank you so much to Paul and Glenda and Sherida, Lindsay and Marissa for an amazing conversation. I'm feeling really inspired, and I feel like every time I sit through one of these sessions, I just feel like there's more and more hope. And the more we share, you know, our ideas and information, it's just more powerful. And there really is hope. And that's the thing that I like to take away from, you know, frankly, every day. But thank you guys very much for inspiring hope and giving us some real tools that we can use to make change into the future. So please do join the cohorts. They're really amazing ways to deep dive into topics, and some great ideas coming out of them, and really amazing relationships being forged as well. I want to highlight our upcoming events. You can check out the slide on the screen. October 20th, we've got an all industry event in the Bay Area. And then November 9th and 11th is IMEX America. And then on November 16th, we've got an ILEA event. And then come back and join us on January 11th for the SFSE Thought Leaders Roundtable. And then I just want to do another plug for follow us on social media, keep in touch. You can see information about events and promote and social, do all the things that we do on social if you could, and say a final word of thanks to our sponsors. We really can't do these programs without them. Solus, thank you so much, MedEvent and Orange Photography. Okay, so that is a wrap for today. We hope we see you in the cohort and in our future events, and we'll stay in touch by email. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks, everyone.